In March 2001, an Angelfire blog caught, well, fire, thanks to a story about a hobbyist cave explorer named Ted. The tale unfolded through a series of diary-style updates where Ted shared his exploits in real time as he and another explorer descended a narrow passage he called Floyd's Tomb, named after a fellow adventurer, Floyd Collins, who had died in 1925 after getting trapped underground. At first, the entries were dry and uneventful. Measurements of the tunnel, notes about equipment, and a few grainy snapshots of rock walls. Just text on a webpage and a handful of photos that read like a working caver's log. Then, the tone shifts. Ted hears strange noises echoing in the dark, inhuman screams that send his imagination into a frenzy. He half expects to brush up against the face of a demon hiding just out of sight. Later, the cave gets tighter, the air goes rancid, and the rotting smell of death fills his nostrils. Ted's partner panics, but things get really dicey on one excursion when their climbing rope is pulled back into the void by an unseen hand. Readers weren't sure if they were following a rescue mission unfolding in real time or falling for an elaborate hoax, but they kept refreshing the page, desperate for answers to the mysteries that had been described. The story ends abruptly, with Ted hinting at one more future trip to the cave, with a promise to update the site again afterwards. I will conquer this cave, then I will return and update this website immediately. That update never came. In the end, the story turned out to be nothing more than a compelling piece of fiction, but it blurred the lines between fact and fantasy so well that it inadvertently created the blueprint for a new brand of horror. Ted the Caver was different from the urban legends that had been passed down throughout human existence. It wasn't spread over a campfire or after lights out at a sleepover. It was perhaps the first such story to gain its infamy digitally. It's widely considered to be the beginning of a trend that came to define horror on the early internet. Years later, we would give those stories a name: creepypasta.
You're 12 years old again. It's past your bedtime. You're hiding underneath your blanket, listening for your parents' footsteps in the hallway, knowing that you're not gonna get any sleep tonight because you're reading creepypastas.
And let me tell you boys, in this case, the truth is a whole hell of a lot stranger than fiction.
We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest inner mind.
Creepypasta infection spread all over the internet.
Morgan handed me the knife. Go ballistic, go crazy. Stab, 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 stab.
The girls said they were trying to mimic a horror story character on a website called Creepypasta.
If you think you know about the bad things, you may decide that you have it all figured out, but you don't. Because the truth is worse than monsters or men.
Welcome to Horror History. I know I'm overdue for this episode of Horror History, but hey, you can't really overcook pasta. Creepypasta can be best described as a modern evolution of humanity's original form of entertainment, storytelling by oral tradition. Back in our species' cave-dwelling days, tall tales were created to excite, frighten, and ultimately educate the audience about the hidden dangers of the world. Many historians believe cryptids like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster to have originally been stories created by parents to keep kids safe from large wild animals. When law and religion emerged, these stories became morality plays and cautionary tales dressed as ghost stories. The Man with the Hook warned teenagers about the perils of sneaking off to Lover's Lane. Bloody Mary punished those who dabbled in the supernatural. As technology became a part of our lives, scary stories were there to warn of the potential dangers, like The Babysitter and The Man Upstairs, which told of an eerie phone call from a stranger and reminded us to stay vigilant because sometimes danger comes from inside the house. These stories used fear as a mechanism for survival training, and some of them were so effective they ended up being passed across generations. In the 21st century, those lessons didn't vanish, they mutated. Instead of fireside circles or whispered dares, we passed around digital ghosts. Blogs blurred reality until you couldn't tell where the facts ended and the nightmare began. Chain emails became curses with ominous messages like pass this on or die. These were the internet's first viral horror hoaxes. I don't know what's scarier, the threat of dying in your sleep because you only forwarded that death hoax email to 9 friends, or getting chewed out by your parents because you surfed the web for too long and tied up your family's phone line with your dial-up internet connection. I'm genuinely asking because I grew up with cable internet. I don't know the answer to that question. But reaching its peak in the mid-2010s, creepypasta became the de facto folklore of an entire generation who grew up with the internet playing a major part of their social lives and their discovery of content. It was one of the biggest, if not the biggest topic in the online horror media landscape, but it came to be a prime example of the classic idiom: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So what was the story with creepypasta? To fully understand the scope and scale of the creepypasta phenomenon, we have to go all the way back to the dark ages of the internet, the mid-1990s. In the 90s, the web was a patchwork of GeoCities homepages and Usenet groups. From what I understand, Usenet was a decentralized bulletin board system where people posted messages called articles, which were then filtered into categories called news groups. Think of it like a prehistoric Reddit, minus the upvotes and power-hungry moderators. Usenet frequenters discussed and debated everything under the sun, from NFL stats to the policies of politicians to dating advice and even wild conspiracy theories about the JFK assassination. I guess some things on the internet never change. While academics used it to argue over the latest research, casual users pioneered the first memes before they were called memes, coined internet slang.
Now we've all seen them. Let's go ahead and take a look. LOL, laugh out loud, BRB, be right back, TTYL, talk to you later.
And they were some of the first trailblazers to engage in flame wars, an endless cycle of insults and arguments that are still a cornerstone of internet culture today, for better or for worse. Mostly for worse. Amid this pixelated playground of clashing ideas and online shenanigans, horror carved out its own tune, with a handful of Usenet forums in particular laying the groundwork for what would later become creepypasta. In the early days of the internet, Usenet forums like alt.folklore.urban became the central spot for dissecting and debunking urban legends, while alt.horror was a catch-all horror hub where people traded scary stories and posted any scraps of horror content they could dig up. There were also subgroups like alt.horror.cthulhu, for example, which just focused on Lovecraftian horror. The most relevant Usenet group for this video had to have been alt.horror.creative, which was a hub for original horror fiction online, making it a proto-creepypasta breeding ground where writers posted rough stories and other users piled on with edits, additions, or entirely new spins. It was chaotic, unmoderated, and anonymous, which gave the stories a raw collaborative energy that you couldn't find in a bookstore. Instead of one person telling a scary tale around the fire, it was 50, or maybe more. Each voice could interrupt, add details, and argue about what really happened. Scary stories have always had a way of changing over time as the telephone effect caused details to skew with each retelling, but on the internet it was happening in real time. One of the first legends that felt truly new came from a print journalist in Abilene, Texas in 1996. According to his story, Brian Bethel sat in his car outside a strip mall after finishing a late shift at the local paper. While writing a check to pay his cable bill, that's how you know it took place in 1996, the hairs on his neck suddenly stood on edge. He looked up from his checkbook and noticed a group of teenagers standing next to his car. They knocked on the window, asking for a ride to their mom's house to get money to buy a movie ticket. On paper, the request seemed innocent enough, but Brian became uneasy when he considered two strange details. The movie they wanted to see had already started 45 minutes earlier, and in the dim light of the parking lot, he noticed that their eyes were completely black. Which would probably be more concerning than the movie thing, but that's just me. One of the teens leaned in and said, "We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay." Bethel sped away in a hurry, terrified. Glancing back through his rearview mirror, the teens had completely vanished. When he got home, the reporter did what came naturally. He wrote down every detail of the encounter.
I shared it initially with a small group of people on a listserv back in the day, you know, the email lists that had to do with paranormal accounts, and then it kind of got out from there, and then as it proliferated, this became, I guess you would call it, an early viral sensation, even before we had that terminology.
To this day, Bethel swears that the black-eyed kids are as real as anything he's ever experienced in his life. Whether you buy his story or not, I do not, what's undeniable is that his account sparked one of the first true online horror sensations. The story quickly spread like digital wildfire, a fire that continues to burn to this day, with interest in the topic peaking in 2013. It burns especially bright in the UK, where headlines about black-eyed kids have been splashed across the front pages of prominent British tabloids on several occasions. Like every good myth, each retelling, no matter where it comes from, tweaks the original recipe. In some versions, the kids knock on front doors, asking to use the phone or the bathroom, while others have them begging for candy on Halloween night, always with the same refrain, "Let us in." The collaborative nature of the web meant that anyone could claim it, reshape it, or swear it had happened to them. If you're like me, you've probably never heard Brian's version of the story in his car, but are still very familiar with black-eyed children, and that speaks to how it became a communal legend. It's less about one story and more about the impact that it had on everyone, the surefire sign of a classic. Dreadnot and Fright.com pushed the concept further, offering interactive episodic horror stories. Dreadnot's most unsettling creation was a story about the Evers family, whose son Toby mysteriously vanished after leaving his computer class. What begins with his mother and a private investigator sifting through his school locker quickly spirals into something much stranger. The narrative weaves in cult leaders, biblical scripture, and even angelic figures that hint at a supernatural culprit behind the boy's disappearance. Told through shifting points of view, the story forced readers to stitch together fragments like evidence in a case file, grounding its horror with real names and recognizable locations. Fright.com's standout tale was called E-Leech, a cyberpunk nightmare framed through the diary entries and chat logs of a teenage hacker named Iona, who attempts to tap into data collected by NASA's Galileo probe, but accidentally uncovers a sentient alien computer virus that eats network storage space, replicates endlessly, and can transmit itself directly into the human brain through flickering computer screens. The story occasionally links to the real NASA website, upping user immersion and adding a real sense of danger to anyone exploring Iona's logs. And considering how many people I see falling for scams and misinformation on the modern internet, maybe more of you need to get scared straight by this story about digital brain implantation. Sadly, neither site survives today, but their influence is unmistakable. They showed early users how the internet wasn't just a tool for sharing scary stories, it could be a medium itself. Something that creepypasta would later embrace. But don't break out the strainer and red sauce quite yet, because these stories had the creepy, but they didn't quite have the pasta. In other words, they were basically confined to certain communities. They didn't have that viral spread, and they, for the most part, didn't leave readers convinced that their stories were real. The cauldron was not truly set for creepypasta until 1999, the year of a little $60,000 horror movie called The Blair Witch Project.
Tell me where you are, John!
Being on such a limited budget, the PR firm promoting the movie set up a bare-bones website, blairwitch.com, which appeared to visitors as nothing more than a digital archive. The site was filled with missing person flyers, mock police reports, fabricated interviews, and folklore about a witch in the Maryland woods. All of it was invented for the movie, crafting a tale of these three indie filmmakers who went missing while making a documentary and requiring the viewer to see their found footage movie to learn what happened to them. But to anyone stumbling across these web pages by happenstance in 1999, it felt like you were reading leaked case files never meant for public consumption. You have to keep in mind that nothing like this had been done before, and people generally believed the things that they read about due to the accuracy and verification standards that legacy media used to have. The Blair Witch site drew over 20 million visitors before the film hit theaters, a staggering number for the time and even today. Many ticket holders walked into the movie convinced that Heather, Josh, and Mike were actually missing. That viral buzz, powered almost entirely by its guerrilla marketing campaign, propelled the Blair Witch Project into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. That campaign is often cited as the true precursor to creepypasta, because it proved the power of belief by letting audience participation do the heavy lifting, and it showed that people had an appetite for this kind of raw, grassroots horror. And despite the Blair Witch Project becoming the most successful movie ever for a decade there, looking at the ratio of budget to box office gross, the internet served that hunger better than Hollywood ever could. The place thrived on anonymity and unverified information. As the 2000s dawned and message boards became the new digital town square, another important cultural phenomenon occurred. On message boards, users traded posts they called copypasta, a literal portmanteau for media copied and pasted all over the internet. According to all known laws of aviation, there's no way that a bee should be able to fly. Its wings are too small to get its fat little body off the ground. The bee, of course, flies anyway, because bees don't care what humans think is impossible. I'll have you know that I graduated top of my class in the Navy SEALs, and I've been involved in numerous secret raids on Al-Qaeda, and I have over 300 confirmed kills. These copypastas took many forms, from bizarre blocks of distorted letters with hidden messages called Zalgo text, to snippets of internet comments, usually mocking someone who thinks they're hot shit. Engaging as they were, anonymous one-offs could only take the subgenre so far. If these digital campfire tales were ever going to leave the message boards and hit the main stage, they needed more than quick jolts of fear. They needed genre icons. Two early web stories helped point the way forward, the first of which was Ted the Caver in 2001. I already dove into Ted's story at the top of this video, pun intended. The claustrophobic Angelfire blog blurred fact and fiction so convincingly, readers weren't sure if they were following a real-life disaster or an elaborate hoax. Its abrupt ending, with no resolution or definitive answers, only deepened the mystery and cemented its reputation. It's generally cited as the first ever creepypasta, even though the term creepypasta didn't exist yet. Which is certainly debatable, since genre is subjective and the internet is endless, but it did establish many mainstays of the movement, like first-person narrative, mimicry of an existing format, in this case diary logs, fact-fiction ambiguity, viral shareability, and a good old cliffhanger ending. Earlier examples on Dreadnot or Fright.com were mostly understood to be fiction, since the stories contained written-by credits like that of a fictional novel. Despite not being much of a horror fan himself, author Ted Hedgeman is thrilled with his story's enduring legacy, even if his embellished spelunking diary was never meant to start a revolution.
It was getting thousands of views over time, so I knew people were reading it, but I really had no idea how they were finding it, or so I just did Google searches and just found tons and tons of forums where people were talking about it. I was just grinning from ear to ear the whole time because I had no idea.
3 years later, another story, the Dionaea House, blew that formula wide open. Created by Eric Heiserer, the future screenwriter who would eventually pen the films Arrival and Bird Box, the story began as a chain of emails between friends investigating a mysterious house tied to several disappearances. Unlike Ted, the story wasn't confined to a single page. The Dionaea House forced readers to chase clues scattered across blogs, websites, and chat logs, piecing together the timeline like, well, me. If horror history existed back then, this would have made an excellent episode. The amateur detectives reading the story would eventually make a chilling discovery. The house was alive. It lured people inside with the promise of shelter, and then ate them. Okay, it definitely is creepier when it's only told through environmental storytelling. Heiserer said he came up with the idea during a late-night, insomnia-fueled Discovery Channel binge, which I'm pretty sure is how Wendigoon also gets his ideas. Heiserer was fascinated by footage of carnivorous plants, particularly the Venus flytrap, known scientifically as Dionaea muscipula. In an interview with Go Into the Story, he said, "The narrator was describing the flytrap, which looks actually very different from my initial idea of what the plant looks like. I had sort of like the Little Shop of Horrors picture in my head. In reality, it's this massive coffee table-sized plant full of tiny little pod-like mouths, hundreds of them." The narrator said something like, "disguised as shelter for insects." That phrase stuck in my brain and made me think, wait, what if those aren't houses? What if we're the insects here? Coincidentally, I've been obsessed with Venus flytrap videos as of late. There are all these channels who experiment with putting various bugs into the trap and seeing if they can escape. Now I know how the Roman spectators felt in the Colosseum. This is cinema. Stories like Ted the Caver and the Dionaea House expanded the perception of what online horror could do, but the budding subgenre still didn't have a name. Somewhere between 2005 and 2007, users began calling these eerie stories creepypasta, a portmanteau of creepy and copypasta. The label stuck almost instantly. Within a few short years, creepypasta had become the internet's default banner for viral scary stories. But with no central archive, these stories were scattered across Angelfire homepages and forums like Something Awful and, yes, even 4chan. Because of this, these works were painfully fragile. Entire pieces could be lost overnight when a thread was deleted. So the question became who, if anyone, would preserve this new folklore. One of the internet's most chaotic troll pits provided an answer.
Hello, Encyclopedia Dramatica.
Launched in 2004, Encyclopedia Dramatica is basically the Onion of Wikipedia. Instead of serious wiki articles, it was a lot of troll content, shock content, and lolcow articles. The articles tend to rip the subjects apart with edgy and offensive humor, written less to inform and more to provoke. And that it did beautifully.
Why would you do that?
The ED community revels in posting vile material, none worse than the infamous offended page. Users brave, or stupid enough to visit it, are treated to galleries of mutilated bodies, snapshots of STD-ridden genitalia, photos of bowel movements, and just a lot of the most disturbing body horror that you can imagine. Dramatica was also sort of a beacon for trolls looking to cause general mayhem online, like the time they posted flashing images all over the forums of the Epilepsy Foundation, because every website used to have forums for some reason. The prank allegedly triggered real seizures in photosensitive users. The thing is, nobody is above getting ripped to shreds on Encyclopedia Dramatica. And when you're decimating lolcows, you have to be pretty good at archiving and keeping your receipts. And because of this, it ended up being a pretty reliable place to archive the infancy of creepypasta. Not out of respect, but of ridicule. As you can imagine, most amateur authors online didn't have the same storytelling chops as the creators of Ted the Caver or Black Eyed Kids. Trolls being trolls, they needed a constant supply of targets to feed their venom. And so, ironically, trolling ended up saving the folklore that they set out to mock. The jesters became the involuntary museum curators. Intentional or not, preservation gave the stories time and space to mature. Because nothing on the internet was ever truly inaccessible. Readers could always dig up old tales, remix them, and then spin bold and new nightmares out of familiar DNA. In that constant cycle of resurrection and mutation, creepypasta stopped being disposable content and started becoming legendary. Enter the late 2000s, an era that gave us creepypasta's first true mascots. Excerpt from a local newspaper. Ominous unknown. Killer is still at large. After weeks of unexplained murders, the ominous unknown killer is still on the rise. After little evidence has been found, a young boy states that he survived one of the killer's attacks and bravely tells his story. In 2007, Jeff the Killer emerged as the poster child for edgy teen creepypasta horror, a story about a bullied boy turned sadistic murderer, immortalized by his ghost-pale skin, lidless eyes, and carved-on smile. The story itself was clunky and often mocked for its lackluster writing, I am 12 and this is deep cliches, and lack of subtlety in trying to be edgy.
When he got home, his parents asked him how his day was, and he replied in a somewhat ominous voice,
It was a wonderful day.
But in the end, the image of Jeff endured. In most versions, Jeff is a troubled teenager, plagued by a persistent bloodlust. After his family moves to a new neighborhood, he's continually hit with what the author repeatedly describes as a weird feeling whenever things don't go his way. Following a fight at school one day, a bully sets Jeff's face on fire, leaving him permanently disfigured. But he doesn't despair. Instead, he embraces the mutilation, carving a smile-shaped scar on his own face that augments the inhuman look. His ghoulish face becomes a mask of madness, complementing an insatiable urge to kill, and a truly twisted catchphrase.
Go to sleep.
Jeff became the genre's new boogeyman, redrawn in fan art, expanded in fan fiction, and reimagined in countless retellings. He was really the first creepypasta character to transcend his source material. His popularity was so widespread that it got to the point where you could no longer tell who was mocking him and who was serious.
Oh, YouTube, I am Jeff the Killer.
I'm finding the best clips while making this video. Thank you Past CZ for having this idea. Hot on the heels of Jeff's explosive popularity, Creepypasta.com launched in 2008, the first dedicated hub for the subgenre that had, until then, basically survived on scraps and word of mouth. Before the site's launch, posts were easily buried on disorganized message boards, lost to thread deletions, or preserved haphazardly on troll sites like Encyclopedia Dramatica. But now, like the time Olive Garden upgraded their menu, the pastas had a proper home. Categories, tags, and a submission system gave the movement shape. Jeff the Killer proved audiences would rally around a recurring character, and Creepypasta.com gave those same readers a proper library. And it didn't take long for that library to find its next hot title. Does anyone remember Smile.jpeg? Like the site that hosted it, the story was also released in 2008 and centered around a cursed image, a grainy photo of a nightmarish dog with human-like teeth grinning from ear to ear. Anyone unlucky enough to view it was said to be plagued by night terrors, driven insane, or even compelled to spread the image and its sickness to others. While the concept of this story is essentially no different from the chain email hoaxes that I mentioned earlier, what made Smile.jpeg so powerful was how its popularity was pulled by a single lo-fi still image. Unlike traditional horror, which relies on deep lore and relatable characters, this story centered around a viral artifact, an actual .jpeg file you might stumble upon by chance and be tricked into opening. You see, for 15 years, I have been haunted by Smile.jpeg. Smile Dog comes to me in my sleep every night. I know that sounds silly, but it is true. I see the beckoning hand. I see Smile Dog. It talks to me, and I know exactly what it means. It wants me to show it to someone else. There is a narrator character, a college student telling about his investigation into the image, but we learn almost nothing about him. The story is all about his research into the image for the article that he wants to write. In the end, someone sends him the image, and he contemplates giving into his curiosity and opening it, despite knowing the danger in doing so. Almost 2 decades later, you can still feel Smile.jpeg's influence thanks to the 2022 horror movie Smile and its 2024 sequel/water commercial Smile 2, both of which are about a smiling curse that compels its victims to spread it further. I can't say for sure whether the creepypasta was a direct inspiration for the movie series. There's no evidence that that's the case, but there's no denying the similarities.
I'm seeing something no one else can see except for me. It's smiling at me.
While Smile.jpeg conjured terror with a single image, the next great creepypasta, Cove, leaned even harder into minimalism, centering its story on not an item, but a memory. Written by Chris Straub in 2009, Cove's story was told through a simple message board thread, where strangers reminisced about an obscure children's show they half remembered from the 1970s. At first, the posts feel innocent enough. Users swap hazy recollections about the strange pirate characters or bizarre puppet designs. Then the memories get stranger. One user recalls a villain named the Skin Taker, a creature who wears a cloak made from the skin of children over his naked bones. Another poster chimes in, claiming they watched an entire episode, but the puppets did nothing but scream and cry into the camera for 30 minutes straight. Someone else mentions the Laughing Stock, a pirate ship with a hideous laugh and a massive grinning mouth that looks like it's swallowing the sea. As we get deeper into the thread, the memories become more fragmented, clashing with everything that came before. Finally, one user drops a gut punch. Their mother insisted there was no show, only static on screen. The mother remarks, "You had a big imagination with your little pirate show." By rooting its horror in the frailty of memory and the unreliability of collective nostalgia, Cove became a milestone in the lost media subgenre. Its reputation only grew when Sci-Fi dramatized the story for a 2016 season of Channel Zero, a show with excellent initials.
There you are. I can see you.
You know, it's strange. I kind of remember those Channel Zero episodes, but when I tried to rewatch them for my research on this episode, all I got was 40 minutes of static. While Candle Cove contained themes relating to collective hysteria, the next breakout pasta icon may have actually been an example of mass delusion.
I said no!
The viral hits kept coming all throughout 2009, including the Rake, a legend about a pale humanoid monster with dark hollow eyes, unnaturally long limbs, and knife-like fingers that resemble the tines in a garden rake, hence the name. In truth, the first Rake post actually seems to come from a WordPress blog from back in 2006, but it only has one comment, so I'm guessing it didn't really take off until it ended up on 4chan's X-board in 2009, where dozens of anonymous users swapped stories about a chalk-white monster that crouched by people's beds at night, looking to satisfy a taste for raw meat. Sometimes it just stared at you for hours, other times it shredded up its victims. Much like the black-eyed kids from the 90s, the Rake felt like it had a life outside the screen, like you might actually run into this thing if you were unlucky. A series of encounters by random people around the world feels a lot more plausible than one central story that got really popular. Though probably unintentional, the creature design drew a lot of comparisons to a creation by visual effects wizard Tom Savini, a shrieking beast with bloodshot eyes and a body that resembled a hairless white monkey. It was the centerpiece from an episode of the 80s horror anthology series Tales from the Dark Side. Savini named it Lizzie.
Yes, you're so beautiful. Do you know what? I don't know. What am I going to do with it?
The difference with the Rake is it's taller and considerably slimmed down, in some depictions looking emaciated, which seems to be a common theme during the creepypasta era of horror. The horror monsters of the 1980s were generally kind of pudgy. You had things like the Blob, Chucky, even the likes of the Cenobites from Hellraiser and the Killer Clowns from Outer Space. There were more chins in the horror genre than there were at the food court of a Lizzo concert. One of the strongest psychological triggers for fear that I've talked about a million times on this channel is the uncanny, when our brain identifies something that isn't quite right. So, like fashion trends swinging back and forth every couple decades, it makes sense that horror trends would operate on a pendulum. Chunky monsters were in during the 80s and a bit of the 90s, so once they became common, they weren't as scary anymore, and another type of creature became the new uncanny. Something more willowy. Some might even say slender. Unleashed on the web in June 2009 on the Something Awful forum, Slender Man began his unnatural life as part of a Photoshop contest. The rules were simple. Take ordinary photos and edit them so that they appeared paranormal. User Eric Knudsen, no, not the same Eric Knudsen who played Daniel Matthews in Saw 2.
You said that you've played before and you survived.
Yeah.
So that means we can survive.
Yeah.
Submitted 2 black and white photos under the username Victor Surge. Lurking in the background of each image was an unnaturally tall, faceless figure in a dark suit with impossibly long limbs. A stalker of children. He named it the Slender Man. Knudsen said his intent was to make a character whose motivations can barely be comprehended, something that caused unease and terror in a general population. The caption included in his original photo read, "We didn't want to go, we didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified and comforted us at the same time." The other caption provided some context. One of 2 recovered photographs from the Sterling City Library blaze, notable for being the day which 14 children vanished and for what is referred to as the Slender Man. Deformity cited as film defects by officials. Fire at library occurred 1 week later. Actual photograph confiscated as evidence. 1986, photographer Mary Thomas, missing since June 13th, 1986. Knudsen caught lightning in a bottle, igniting an almost instant frenzy. Within days, countless users flooded the forum, eager to carry the baton. They added more photos, created fake newspaper clippings, and contributed their own stories about eerie run-ins with the Slender Man. Other users layered new attributes onto the character. One iteration had tentacles sprouting from his back, others endowed him with powers of invisibility, teleportation, and a mind-shattering slender sickness. And many more argued over his height, which could range anywhere from 7 feet to 15 feet depending on the author. They crafted new names too, like the Tall Man, the Thin Man, Slendy, the Pale One, and the White King. Those last 2 hit a little too close to home. The collaborative floodgates had opened wide, with thousands of anonymous hands contributing to a living legend that transcended the genre, paving the way for Slender Man-inspired media that traveled well beyond the form and gave birth to a new horror icon. Just 10 days after the character's introduction into the world, 3 film students took to YouTube where they unveiled Marble Hornets, an alternate reality found footage web series based on the mythos of Slender Man. Created by Troy Wagner, Joseph DeLage, and Tim Sutton, Marble Hornets begins with a deceptively simple hook. Aspiring director Alex Crayley abruptly abandons his student film after a series of bizarre events. He hands the raw tapes to his friend, Jay, and urges him to burn them. Without a word of explanation, Alex moves to a different town and doesn't speak to his friend again. 3 years go by before Jay works up the nerve to review the footage. When he finally hits play, he's confronted with grainy, shaky clips from a project gone horribly off the rails, distorted audio, jumps of static, and a mysterious, faceless figure called the Operator. Jay uploads the footage online in hopes that viewers can help him piece together the mystery. After a series of entries goes public, an anonymous side channel called To The Ark posts cryptic in-universe messages, containing obscure images and not-so-subtle threats from figures in masks, who fans have dubbed Hoodie and Masky respectively. Messages like, "Stay home, be alone," and "You caused this, you will never be forgiven, he will lead me to you." Despite the comments being disabled for each of these uploads, fans created their own spaces where they obsessively dissected each frame like sacred text, desperate to solve the Marble Hornets puzzle. The series contained 87 entries over a time span of exactly 5 years. This, more than anything, solidified Slender Man's position on top of the creepypasta pyramid. The series has over 100 million views, and it's a genuine masterclass in found footage horror, drawing praise from famed film critic Roger Ebert and even getting a DVD release. I personally followed the channels at the time, and the videos followed the tradition of text-based creepypasta stories by releasing them sporadically, as if the creator was finding them in real time. Sometimes the cadence was daily, sometimes we were left without an update for months. By the end of 2009, creepypasta connoisseurs were eating good. The subgenre had gone from scattered curiosities to celebrated characters with mainstream potential. It was a banner year by any measure, but with this added visibility came volatility. The next decade would put this new age folklore to the test. Could creepypasta survive the mainstream spotlight, or would it be consumed by it? By 2010, young authors inspired by the likes of Jeff and Slendy wanted in on the creepypasta craze. Creepypasta.com was great for reading and archiving the best stories, but lacked the things that make internet horror so unique: interactivity and multimedia. In response, fans launched the Creepypasta Wiki, a community-driven site that democratized the genre by allowing anyone to participate. Where the .com was curated like a library, the Wiki was more like a workshop, where you could upload, rate, and expand on the lore of existing characters. Almost immediately, that open-door policy paid off. 2010 saw a flood of brand new era-defining pastas, stories that showed just how far the genre could stretch once the whole community was allowed to experiment. One of the most enduring of that, or any year, was the Russian sleep experiment. Framed as a declassified Soviet-era document, the story recounts how 5 political prisoners were sealed in an airtight chamber and dosed with experimental gas designed to keep them awake for 15 days. At first, the subjects became irritable, then deranged, then utterly inhuman. Some shriek for hours until their vocal cords tear. Others smear feces on the chamber walls. They later turn violent, mutilating themselves in grotesque ways, eating one another, and whispering about the evil that lurks inside every human mind.
We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be freed at every moment in your deepest animal mind.
When soldiers finally entered the chamber to remove the test subjects, they were ripped apart. The few survivors didn't end up lasting long after that. I've never been a huge Russian sleep experiment fan, but it certainly struck a chord with a lot of people, probably due to the format. It's written in a deadpan, mock documentary style, and the story reads like it could have been a legitimate Cold War report lifted from Soviet archives. A text-based story wields a unique power. It lets the reader's imagination conjure horrors far more terrifying than anything explicitly described. There's a fear in the unknown. Stripping away characters and subjectivity from the writing increases the unknown a little bit more, allowing the reader's mind to fill in even more gaps with their own darkest fears. Another medium that takes advantage of this is gaming. In the 2000s, several games took advantage of environmental storytelling. The Metroid Prime trilogy is a great example. Instead of delivering lore in cinematic cutscenes, the game has you scanning objects and reading captain's logs from space pirates on computer screens. But the biggest horror moments in the world of creepypasta came from a different pair of Nintendo franchises, the first being from my favorite gaming franchise. Another viral hit from 2010, Ben Drowned, was about a cursed copy of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Written by college student Alex Hall, otherwise known by his online handle, JaduSable, Ben Drowned inadvertently kicked off the haunted game craze that eventually saw the rise of Sonic.exe, which I covered at length in another video. The story begins with a college sophomore cruising garage sales for deals on Nintendo 64 games. During his search, he's drawn to a strange house with ink blot paintings on a table, one of which looks eerily close to Majora's Mask. Already uneasy, his discomfort spikes when he meets the owner of the home, an old man with a crooked smile, blind in one eye. The narrator desperately wants to bolt, but he shoves down his discomfort long enough to score a bootleg copy of Majora's Mask for free. On his way out, he says thanks to the old man, who says goodbye, Ben, in reply. The narrator assumes he misheard, or maybe the old man has a grandson named Ben and his senile mind mixed them up. When he gets home and boots up the game, he discovers the lone save file labeled Ben. At a glance, he notes that Ben's progress stalled before finishing the Stone Tower Temple, which is the last main dungeon before the end of the game. The narrator starts a fresh save and labels it Link, but the game kinda tweaks out on him. Music plays in reverse, and NPCs say the wrong lines. Sometimes they call him Link, other times it's Ben. Later in the game, you learn the Elegy of Emptiness, which allows the player to create a doppelganger statue of himself for solving puzzles. The Link statue has this kind of creepy, uncanny Icona Valley expression, and in this haunted version of the game, the statue would keep spawning behind the player over and over, as if it were following him. Later, his character begins to spasm randomly on screen, flailing his arms before he's warped to a strange underground tunnel. After a string of deaths and odd glitches, new save files begin to appear on their own, each one a link in a chain that spells out an ominous message. First Ben, then drowned, then your turn. Terrified and desperate for answers, Jadoo Sable returns to the old man's house. But he's not home. Instead, he finds a next-door neighbor who delivers a grim revelation. 8 years earlier, a young boy named Ben drowned in an accident nearby. Ben's ghost is haunting the cartridge, and the narrator by proxy. While the main story ends here, the thing expanded into a huge ARG that left more questions than answers. That same month, another staple of many childhoods was corrupted by keyboard storytellers with the release of the Squidward-centric lost episode, sometimes titled Red Mist. Told from the perspective of a former Nickelodeon intern, the story describes an editing room session that goes from slightly odd to utterly soul-shattering in minutes. It describes the discovery of a lost episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, where SpongeBob's grouchy neighbor, Squidward, loses his will to live, ending in a graphic scene not suitable for TV audiences. Not to be confused with this actual clip from a SpongeBob episode.
I can't seem to get happy. Maybe this will help.
Red Mist is an important chapter of the story of creepypasta as a whole, because it's probably the most iconic example of what would become known as the lost episode subgenre, which were known for putting a creepy twist on nostalgic and beloved classics from SpongeBob SquarePants to Mickey Mouse to The Simpsons. Another standout creepypasta that put a haunting spin on existing media was Normal Porn for Normal People, a story about a website aimed at eradicating abnormal sexuality. The writer goes on to describe how when he or she received an email from a stranger containing a link to the site, the videos found on there got increasingly stranger and more disturbing. Like a repairman passionately licking a washing machine for 7 minutes straight, an elderly woman making out with a mannequin, an obese mime sobbing quietly to himself, a dog forced to eat a peanut butter sandwich until it gets sick, and a man with no legs attempting to breakdance.
Stumps.avi, a 5-minute long video where a man with no legs is attempting to breakdance on a DDR mat in what looks like the kitchen from Peanut.avi, but much dirtier. There's a radio playing music unseen in the background, but it stops at the 4-minute mark when the man collapses on the mat in exhaustion. He breathes heavily and pleads with someone off screen to let him rest. This off-screen person becomes terrifyingly enraged and yells at him to keep dancing, which he does. You can hear this off-screen person begin to scream as the video ends abruptly.
It gradually becomes clear that the subjects of these seemingly random videos are being forced to make them in one location by the same producer, but the site disappears just as quickly as it popped up, and we never get any real answers. You've probably noticed this was another common element of these stories. Just as the recesses of the human mind are better at filling in scary visuals, the same could be applied to ambiguous endings. And again, this is something that the internet could do, but didn't really work in Hollywood, giving the stories an extra touch of realism. That is, until things got too real for their own good. Earlier, I mentioned that 2 Nintendo franchises got the creepypasta treatment and became important pillars of the genre. The first, The Legend of Zelda, shouldn't be a huge surprise. Those games have always been packed with nightmare fuel. Pokémon, on the other hand, is more known for its cute characters and wholesome themes. But that wasn't the case with Lavender Town Syndrome. Released in April 2011, this one is such a classic. No characters, no dialogue, it's just a straight up description of an incident that the story alleges took place upon the Japanese release of Pokemon Red and Green in 1996. According to the text, 200 children died after reaching Lavender Town in the game. The music that plays in this area was said to have extremely high frequencies that only kids can hear, causing them to become ill with the so-called Lavender Town syndrome. There's always been something unsettling about Lavender Town within the Pokemon canon. It's the location of the Pokemon graveyard and subject of multiple dark fan theories. Now, before we flip the calendar and move on from 2011, there's one more pasta from that year that I want to bring up. Unlike the others, it's not particularly well known, but it is a personal favorite of mine, and it's called Masterpiece. The unnamed child narrator describes the situation. After hearing screams from inside the house, the protagonist finds some inhuman creature dragging mom and dad into his or her bedroom, where it sets them up and uses their blood to paint something on the wall. The narrator hides under the covers, too afraid to move. This thing had made what it would probably call a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled a message onto the wall that I could not read in the darkness. Then it positioned itself under my bed, waiting to strike. The scariest thing now is my eyes have adjusted to the darkness since then, and I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it because it's terrifying to think about, but I feel I need to see before I'm killed. I peek at the creature's masterpiece. It says, "I know you're awake." It's short, it's simple, and the author is not known, but I think it does what I love most about these stories. It paints the broad strokes and allows the audience to toil over the implications of its existence. A masterpiece indeed. It didn't get as much love when it comes to recognition and fan art, but the next item I'd like to nominate for cultural significance in the National Library of Creepypasta had no shortage of that.
Soon I shall hold in my hand the thing that will sustain you. Your kidney.
Okay. The next character to join the pantheon was Eyeless Jack. Sporting a blue mask, black hoodie, and an insatiable appetite for freshly harvested human organs, Jack began digital life much like Slender Man did, as a still image. In June of 2010, the first ever photo of Eyeless Jack was posted on 4chan under the title Nightmare Fuel. There was no lore attached, no details about his motivations or habits, just a mask that sent shockwaves rippling through 4chan servers. 2 years later, a Creepypasta Wiki user named Azel5000 penned the first known attempt at an origin story. In this telling, Eyeless Jack was a 19-year-old college student named Jack Nyros, who fell into the clutches of a demon-worshipping cult. During a ritual sacrifice meant to prepare him as a vessel for an inhuman host, the cult gouged out his eyes and poured hot tar into the empty sockets. I wonder if the football coach got fired for that one. Somehow, Jack survived the ordeal. The demon summoning ritual didn't work, but Jack became kind of a demon himself, reborn as a bloodthirsty prowler, black tar endlessly spilling from the holes where his eyes used to sit as he feeds on the kidneys of his victims. I'm honestly not sure what the whole kidney thing is about.
Oh, they took my freaking kidney!
Eyeless Jack was not the only Jack to become a household name, however.
James's body was nailed up on the wall. The nails pierced through his hands and feet, and his chest was cut wide open, and his organs hung down to the floor, and his eyes and tongue had been removed along with most of his teeth, and I was disgusted. I could hardly believe that this was my baby boy.
I'm literally having goosebumps. My hair is standing up.
The other flavor of Jack, Laughing Jack, started as a kid's imaginary friend before going full Pennywise. His lore is outlined across 2 stories, both written by the author Snuffbomb in 2013, Laughing Jack and the prequel, The Origin of Laughing Jack. In the origin story, Jack was created by a guardian angel in the 1800s as a magical Jack-in-the-Box toy meant to be a companion to a lonely child named Isaac Grossman. But Isaac was shipped off to boarding school where he ended up becoming a serial killer. Meanwhile, Jack was left to rot inside of his box. With no one to play with, he slowly lost his colors, turning monochrome and absorbing the cruelty of his absentee owner. Years later, when Laughing Jack was finally freed from his box, his dark metamorphosis was complete. Fully demonic, Jack killed Isaac with the same weapons he used to torture his victims, a dark mirror of his owner's cruelty. From then on, Jack became a parasitic imaginary friend to lonely or neglected children, luring them in with candy and games before tearing them apart, their souls trapped forever in a nightmarish carnival-themed limbo where Pop Goes the Weasel plays on an endless loop.
A penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle. That's the way the money goes. Pop goes the weasel.
For anyone who doesn't speak Old English, the song has a tragic hidden meaning about poverty and desperation. Pop was a 19th century slang for pawning something, and weasel meant your coat. Translation, the song is about hawking the shirt off your back just to survive, which means this playful chant was actually a quiet cry for help. That same bitter irony runs through the backstory of another iconic creepypasta villain, Ticcy Toby. Created in 2013 by user Castaway, Toby began life as Toby Rogers, a troubled teenager with Tourette's and a rare condition that makes him numb to physical pain. But what he can't feel with his body, he more than makes up for with blinding emotional trauma. Bullied at school, abused at home, and disturbed by the death of his sister in a car wreck, Toby finally snaps. He starts hearing voices, evil whispers that urge him to kill his alcoholic father. Consumed by madness and grief, Toby carves his father up with a kitchen knife, then starts a fire to distract police as he flees into the woods. Once there, he crosses paths with a tall, spindly man in a dark suit, Slender Man. No longer human and armed with a pair of his dead father's bloody hatchets, Toby becomes one of Slender's proxies, much like Masky and Hoodie from the Marble Hornets series. Ticcy Toby is an interesting case because he did essentially springboard off the popularity of Slender Man, but became a pretty popular character in his own right, being featured in many of the tier lists and character lineup artworks that were so popular at the time. If you liked creepypasta and you had a social media account in the early 10s, one of these images was probably your banner. While I guess Eric Knudsen technically owns the copyright for Slender Man, his encouragement for anyone online to participate by referring to him as an open source creature made the character effectively public domain. I've talked about the idea of open source canon before on my channel, but long story short, there are pros and cons. The pros are that you have dynamic storytelling that allows for a lot of innovation and creativity. The cons are that the author loses control of the narrative, and these types of projects tend to drift towards the same cliches every time. But thankfully, it wasn't just a free-for-all of different versions and variations on popular stories. Even with a lot of the titles being written anonymously, there were trusted voices in this community, with the power to raise up the writing that they saw as deserving of more exposure. These are essentially the celebrities of the creepypasta fandom. I am of course referring to the narrators.
We did go to all 4 parks. We started with the Hollywood Studios, then Epcot, then the Animal Kingdom, and then finally the Magic Kingdom. I had a great time until I went on Splash Mountain.
I looked into the mirror. My shirt was drenched in blood, except for a pattern of ribs across the front. The blood was still wet to touch. My pockets were full of cartilage. My socks were soaked in afterbirth.
I had a bad dream and woke up in the middle of the night. I saw that for some reason, the window was open, even though I remember it being closed before I went to bed.
The rise of creepypasta narrations blasted the genre into a new stratosphere. Heavyweights like Mr. Creepypasta and Creeps McPasta took already iconic characters and gave them a voice, while shining a light on lesser-known pastas that might have otherwise been forgotten. Their early performances were scrappy, full of enough lo-fi jank to make you wonder if they were recorded under a blanket fort. These early videos were often one-take wonders, complete with flubs and retakes left in. Call it lazy if you want, but there's also something about it that adds to the charm. It's like your best friend with a flashlight at 2 AM, whispering the local legend his older brother swore was true. As the genre exploded through the early 2010s, these videos became a little more buttoned up, with some narrators like Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and The Dark Somnium putting on full-scale audio drama productions. The cherry on top was the music, or in many cases, the music. Miyuji, who now goes by Miyu, or his government name Nicholas Gasparini, is the dark pianist whose haunting royalty-free tracks became so tied to the genre that a video didn't feel official until his music crept in underneath. Making his stuff available for creators to use for free was a stroke of genius that made his stuff the unofficial soundtrack of the whole entire community, whose impact cannot be understated.
There's no way that a scary story can live without the music behind it. If I told a scary story and I literally just had the same exact, this makes atmosphere, man. Wonderful music.
Yeah, the Mr. Creepypasta Miyu duo was so iconic that the two started making big convention appearances together. Personally, I loved drifting off to sleep as I listened to creepypasta narrations in the early to mid 2010s. Sometimes the voices would even bleed into my dreams and I would just find myself in the creepypasta story. I haven't done it in a long time, but I always felt like it was amazing whenever I pulled this off. It was like being in a movie. Now, there was one creepypasta story whose audio drama adaptation got a little more firepower than all of the others, and that was Borrasca. First published on the No Sleep subreddit in 2015, Borrasca was a 4-part narrative story about a protagonist whose family moves to a quiet mining town in Missouri, but he soon discovers it has a dark underbelly of secrets. Borrasca is the name of a mine located deep in the mountains from which a grinding metal sound can be heard emanating. It's said to be the home of horrifying monsters like the Shiny Gentleman and the Skinned Man. Later, when his sister goes missing, he becomes convinced that Borrasca has something to do with it. More girls go missing, casting a dark cloud over the town, but eventually the protagonist and his friend discover the location of the fabled mine. What they find there is a house of horrors so depraved it goes beyond the wildest stretches of what their imaginations believed was possibly going on inside these subterranean excavation sites. I'm not gonna spoil the ending, because this one is truly one of the most epic creepypasta nightmares ever conceived. The reason I wanted to bring it up though is because it's an excellent example of what would become the main theme of creepypasta in the late 10s, that is, mainstream adoption. After Borrasca achieved viral success, the author, Rebecca Klingel, was hired by director Mike Flanagan to write on his Netflix adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House that came out in 2018. Borrasca itself was adapted by the audio production studio Cove, who turned it into a full-scale audio drama series starring Cole Sprouse, a man so famous he has an entire Instagram account dedicated to catching strangers who try to take pictures of him. The audio drama was a huge deal for independent authors everywhere.
They told me they thought she ran away back to St. Louis.
Dad, what's happening?
Sit down, Sammy.
Wendy!
No one was looking to find her.
What was Borrasca?
A place where bad things happen.
The series didn't air until 2020, but come 2016, I tried my own hand at some creepypasta audio productions when I launched my series, All Dente Creepypasta.
Hello, and welcome to All Dente Creepypasta. Horror stories cooked to perfection with a splash of red sauce.
These weren't true creepypastas in the sense that they had been copy and pasted from somewhere on the internet, but they carried the same style, first-person perspective, mood, and aura of the pastas that came before. My thing was to write my own original stories and deliver them with cinematic sound design, music, and visuals, giving the audience something they couldn't find anywhere else. One story that I wrote that became pretty popular was called Creepy Clown School Lockdown, about a man recalling how his elementary school was stalked by a creepy clown, instilling a new lifelong fear in the narrator.
And that's when I saw a clown crash up against the glass and stare at me with those wide eyes. It may have been just some teenagers or YouTubers pulling a prank, but I ran as fast as I could and didn't stop until I was locked inside of my room, because clowns terrify me now.
Creepy Clown School Lockdown spawned 4 sequels over a 5-year span. And yes, to those who still ask about it, I would like to go back and finish the series at some point. I've just been busy being the horror history man. But while I was busy writing stories of haunted Disney rides and corrupt offshore casinos, the greater creepypasta community had grown bigger than ever, and had more eyes on it than ever. And that can only mean one thing: controversy was on the horizon. The era of creepypasta narrations didn't just fuel growth for the internet horror ecosystem. It blew the lid right off the pot, making room for brand new subgenres to noodle their way into your bowl. And one of the stickiest and most controversial recipes of the era was the ritual pasta, a step-by-step guided ritual usually performed in exchange for power, forbidden knowledge, or a supernatural item. Living in that liminal space between scary story and dare, these interactive horror guides like The Midnight Game or Three Kings challenge readers to perform unsettling tasks like light candles, mirror gaze, or knock on wood at exactly 3:33 a.m. Fail, and the instructions often promise death, or worse. Ritual urban legends have always been around, with the likes of Bloody Mary and Hanako-san, but the digital internet versions introduced the concept of virality, the idea that you could have your 15 minutes of fame if you pulled it off on camera. This led to the epidemic of challenge videos, which ended up being dangerous and caused a lot of issues for YouTube, but it's probably a topic for a different video. But it does show that the internet has the power to make people do stupid things. Thousands of kids courted catastrophe with ritual pastas, hoping to outlast their friends and gain schoolyard bragging rights. These stories thrived because they weaponized temptation. What if you could cheat death with a ritual? What if one wrong step really did summon something hungry into your bedroom? Most kids laughed off ritual pastas as spooky sleepover dares, but some did not get off so easy. 3 Wisconsin families learned this the hard way. On May 31st, 2014, 2 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin lured their friend into the woods for a game of hide and seek and stabbed her 19 times. When questioned by the police, the girls claimed that the attack was their way of proving themselves to Slender Man in order to become his next proxies.
Did you guys talk about doing this beforehand?
Anisha told me we had to.
Why?
Because she said that he'd kill our families.
Who's he?
There's this website called the Creepypasta Wiki. Okay. It's full of like horror stories that are meant to purposely scare you. And there's one of them called Slender Man.
Who's Slender Man?
He's
He's this tall, faceless man who preys on children.
Anissa explained to me that to prove yourself worthy to Slender, you would have to kill somebody.
Morgan said we have to kill Bella.
The attackers, Anissa Wire and Morgan Geyser, were picked up by police on the side of the interstate highway 5 hours later. They claimed that they were on the way to meet Slender Man at his mansion in the woods, where they believed that they would be allowed to live with him after proving their worthiness. Miraculously, the victim, Peyton Isabella Leitner, survived after 6 days in the hospital. A surgeon treating the girl said that if the wounds had been the width of a human hair deeper, she would have likely died on the operating table.
I shouldn't be alive. I really shouldn't after what happened.
I remember when this happened, and yeah, it was a big deal. In general, people took the time to offer their sympathy to the victim, with Mr. Creepypasta and several other narrators like Madame Macabre coming together for a live stream to raise over $8,000 for her recovery. While the situation was handled with sensitivity, with Eric Knudsen releasing a statement, the community was careful not to accept any blame for what happened. A then Creepypasta Wiki admin wrote, "For someone to make the jump from reading a creepy story that is being presented as 100% fiction into actually using it as a motive to plot and murder another human being, something else has to be going on there." The more I read about the incident itself, the more I remove the shock of Slender Man's name being attached to it and just find the situation really sad. Peyton and Morgan were childhood best friends, a friendship that Anissa seemed to be jealous of. I feel like being attacked within a millimeter of your life is traumatic enough. Those scars will heal, but the betrayal never goes away. A follow-up interview in 2019 revealed that Peyton sleeps with a pair of scissors nearby just in case someone tries to murder her again. That's just depressing. As for the attackers, as I alluded to earlier, they appeared to actually believe that Slender Man was real. Both were found not guilty due to insanity, and both ended up in psychiatric hospitals. Anissa was granted early release in 2021, and Morgan was scheduled for conditional release in 2025, though she's having trouble finding a group home that will take her in, which was part of the conditions of her release. The clear and obvious lesson of this story is to leave the horror on the page in the fictional world. But anyone even remotely paying attention is bound to notice that the two knife-wielding aggressors, who were found to be the subjects of mental disease, believed that they could become Slender Man proxies, just like Ticcy Toby, Masky, and Hoodie, who were also subjects of a mental disease, known by the fans of Marble Hornets as the Slender Sickness. To be entirely clear, this was a self-fulfilling prophecy for the girls. And understandably, it created a genuine moral panic, and seemed to have a chilling effect on creepypasta as a whole. This is the Google Trends graph for the search term creepypasta. The Slender Man stabbing took place on May 31st, 2014. This peak right here represents June 2014. You could argue that the news story about the incident is what caused that spike, and you'd be correct, but it continued to decline for the next 4 years after that. Maybe some of that is the genre just having run its course, but it's not hard to believe that for a lot of people, seeing someone really get hurt just made it too real. Think about it. So much of creepypasta's power as a medium came from blurring the line between fiction and reality. Ted the Caver, Lavender Town Syndrome, the Russian sleep experiments, they all thrived on that little inkling of an idea that any of it could be real. And now, someone had crossed the line and made it real. And this wasn't even the only time this happened. Just a year later, another 12-year-old girl was arrested, this time in Elkhart, Indiana, after killing her stepmother under the belief that she was obeying the commands of Laughing Jack.
The Elkhart, Indiana girl claims that Laughing Jack, a horrifying clown character who appears in stories posted on the website Creepypasta, told her to set her room on fire and stab her stepmother, Maria Torres, repeatedly to death.
According to reports, the 12-year-old had been suffering from dissociative identity disorder and claimed to hear voices that told her to do the things that she did. Strangely, this second case got pretty much no press coverage. The attacker's name, for example, doesn't even appear to be listed anywhere, and I didn't even know about this one until I started researching this video. I'm honestly not sure why this was a smaller story, especially considering that the victim actually died this time. The only thing I can think is that Slender Man was just more of a widely recognized character than Laughing Jack. In any event, it certainly didn't have a positive effect for those involved in the creation and enjoyment of these stories, and a once thriving community would never be the same. Of course, creepypasta didn't die immediately after these incidents happened, but it might have been better if it had, because one of the biggest embarrassments in creepypasta history was still yet to come. A Hollywood movie can be one of the most powerful things in pop culture. Take the 1988 documentary The Thin Blue Line, for example. It examined the trial and conviction of a man accused of shooting a police officer, and the movie presented the evidence in such a compelling way that the case was returned to court for a retrial, resulting in a life sentence in prison being overturned. Now imagine the complete opposite of that. A movie so irrelevant, the only people more pissed off than its haters were its fans. That's pretty much what happened with the Slender Man movie. I mean, who could forget my legendary Things You Missed intro that week? Development of the film began in 2016, and even then, I remember people saying that Hollywood had waited too long. The original Slender Man craze on the Something Awful forums was already 7 years in the past at that point, and the movie wouldn't actually come out until 2018. On one hand, it was exciting to see Sony Pictures embracing an organic creation of the internet. But, as I mentioned before, the stabbing really put a damper on things, and this movie would release at the bottom of that trends graph, all while going up against backlash stemming from the families involved in the tragic attack, who said the quote, crass film extends their pain, and the petition with more than 20,000 signatures calling for the film to be pulled from theaters. All of this could have just been noise, but when the trailers started coming out, they didn't seem to reference the established Slender Man lore from Eric Knudsen, Marble Hornets, or the Creepypasta Wiki. So it made it feel like the movie was cashing in on the 2014 Wisconsin incident more than it was honoring the beloved culture that the community had built. I'm sure all of this would have been forgotten if the movie was good though, but as you've probably figured out by now, audiences were left hungry. It got a measly 8% on Rotten Tomatoes. IndieWire called it a tasteless and inedibly undercooked serving of the internet's stalest creepypasta. At least I can appreciate the continuation of that pun. So here I am now in 2025 thinking, was it really as bad as I remember? And I love Letterboxd because you can just go back and see exactly what you thought at the time. And I said, definitely the worst movie that MoviePass has ever paid $15 for me to see. Holy shit. And the choices they made were just mind-boggling. Like I said, this movie started development 2 years after the stabbing, so they knew the topic was contentious, and despite that, the main characters are teenage girls trying to summon Slender Man at a sleepover, and in the movie, Slender Man infects people's minds. And to be clear, I don't have an issue with the movie adapting real-world crimes, but they forgot to make it good. And you already had so much good Slender Man lore that people love, and you didn't use it. Anyway, this movie was banned from theaters in Waukesha County, but it still did manage to make $50 million on a $10 million budget. On the flip side, while the Slender Man movie was being developed, Channel Zero showed the world how to do it right, at least for the first couple seasons. They invited the original creators into the process, leaned into the quirk, and delivered some good psychological horror in the vein of the stories that built that audience in the first place. After their first season in 2016, where they adapted Candle Cove, they ended up doing 3 more. Season 2 is based on No End House, where a character is challenged to go through a haunted house with increasingly horrifying rooms that play on the person's deepest fear. Season 3, Butcher's Block, was mostly an original narrative, but it did take elements from a story on the No Sleep subreddit called Search and Rescue Woods. The 4th and final season aired in 2018 and is loosely based on another No Sleep story called I Found a Hidden Door in My Cellar and I Think I've Made a Big Mistake. Outside of Channel Zero, there were a couple of other notable creepypasta adaptations planned, such as a creepypasta short film anthology show hosted by Clive Barker, the guy who created Hellraiser and Candyman, and a movie adaptation of the Russian sleep experiment. But both of these were ultimately cancelled during the fallout period after the stabbings, though the reason for the cancellations is not known. But with those projects off the docket, there really hasn't been another pop culture moment for creepypasta as of writing. There was a live tour that Mr. Creepypasta, Creeps McPasta, and Miu embarked on in 2019, where they performed horror story narrations for a live audience and interacted with fans, but in retrospect, that was more of a last hurrah than the start of a new trend. Some authors and narrators carried on as usual, but uploads and views have slowly dwindled over the next decade. And with that decline, audiences have splintered off to other places and other topics that carry the same vibe that creepypasta once did. The aforementioned No Sleep subreddit became a haven for immersive first-person horror framed as true experiences. Its strict in-universe rule that everything posted be treated as real attracted readers looking for more grounded, psychological flavors of dread. Around the same time, analog horror climbed out of the ruins of the exhausted found footage subgenre. Trading shaky cams for static-filled VHS public access shows, series like Local 58 and the Mandela Catalog carried on the torch ignited by creepypasta stories by mimicking established formats for horror. This Local 58 episode, called Contingency, played like an emergency broadcast that calmly informs the viewer that the US has surrendered to an insurmountable enemy force. Citizens are urged to act to preserve the memory of our nation. The broadcast ends with a horrifying reversal. The messages were part of an apparent hoax. The station politely apologizes for the confusion and signs off. Those gunshots you heard next door? Just an unfortunate misunderstanding. That blend of realism and creeping doubt that makes you question everything was the lifeblood of creepypasta, and nowhere is that paranoia more refined than in the genre's most popular successor, the SCP Foundation. An acronym for Special Containment Procedures, SCP weaponized the formula, creating a shared universe of clinical reports on impossible horrors, unkillable creatures, interdimensional beings, and locations that bend the rules of space and time.
SCP-096 went berserk when any of the attending personnel saw its face. In this stage, it would enter a period of considerable and unstoppable distress for 1 to 2 minutes, covering its face and wailing loudly.
The format here is a series of mock scientific reports and short stories that flesh out the universe. The SCP Wiki, as of writing, has over 8,000 SCP files and over 4,000 Foundation tales, submitted by fans from around the world across 16 languages. Like most wikis, anyone can contribute to and refine the shared mythology, and submissions are curated by the community, making it one of the largest collaborative fiction projects in history. It's also one of the most tightly organized thanks to its peer review process, strict formatting rules, classification systems, and community feedback to ensure quality control. These numbers speak to how creepypasta has evolved beyond single stories and beyond the need for centralized storytelling, which does a perfect job of reflecting what makes the age of internet horror different from the trends that ruled the genre in the past. In some ways, this makes modern-day urban legends more frightening, because the entire process of collaborative lore that has to pass the checks and balances of a whole community of editors and moderators kind of mirrors the horror of modern life, where we're under constant surveillance and digital footprints follow us around in a way that makes the stubborn spirits of old seem harmless. While it's easy to attribute the decline of creepypasta to Hollywood's butchering of intellectual properties or the butcherings committed by mentally ill 12-year-olds, my feeling is that both of these only helped speed up the inevitable. By the mid-2010s, the genre had pretty much run its course. Creepypasta blew up at a time when unverified horror accounts on the internet were still fun and spooky, a time before community notes and profit-driven grifters. There's a reason that nearly every classic creepypasta is told in the first person, compared to only like 30% when it comes to traditional novels. Creepypasta brought us back to the oldest kind of storytelling, the campfire tale. Only now, the campfire is digital, the circle of listeners is infinite, and while that fire has faded, it never goes out entirely. If you're interested in me taking a deeper look at any of these creepypasta icons in a future episode of Horror History, be sure to drop me a comment and let me know what you'd like to see. And if you happen to be a fan of alternative music, make sure you check out my second channel, Pumpkin Metal, where I do band history episodes on your favorite pop, punk, and metal bands. And finally, if you love exploring the twisted intersections where fiction bleeds into reality, make sure you subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell, and select all notifications so you don't miss an upload, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.